So, firms might be procuring this technology, but are people using them on a day-to-day basis? And what does that actually look like in terms of engagement and revisiting those tools? I think that there is a bit of a danger if they're not embedded correctly, or there's not sort of the proper change management around it, that people get excited at the start and they start to use it, but maybe it's not giving them the outputs that they had wanted or hoped. And so there begins to be a bit of disillusionment as well, as people begin to experiment.
How do you stay up to date with AI news?
I don't. All right, so welcome to the second episode of Future Ready Lawyer, AI and the Evolution of Legal Practice. In the last episode, we talked about a few different topics briefly, and we said in the future episodes, including today, we're gonna discuss those topics at a much deeper level and go into details. So today we want to talk about how generative AI is being used in practice. And to get there, we will first talk about our assumptions and expectations of how, for instance, legal firms and lawyers have been adopting this technology, a little bit of history of technology in legal firms, and then move on to what actually is happening in legal firms and legal practice in courts, and what are different uses of generative AI. So, Mark, how about you start first and tell us a little bit about what we have been seeing, online, and what are the expectations?
Okay. So I'm really fascinated with what's actually going on in legal practice because I'm a career academic. I don't practice law, but I see people talking about this on LinkedIn. I look at some of the research coming out in terms of surveys, Thomson Reuters and other of the providers. How are lawyers actually using generative AI to get tasks done, to get efficiencies, to even improve the work product? So I've been having a look at some of the more recent surveys that have come out, and it's really interesting to see that there seems to be a shift, just like I see within academia and the law school. And with students, you have a real trickle early on before ChatGPT. I was using OpenAI even before ChatGPT, but very few people were. ChatGPT turns up and you get a stream, and that just keeps on getting more and more volume. And it looks now that we've gone over that threshold of majority use. Most people are trying to use this thing. Most people think that it's just going to get bigger and bigger and more central to legal workflows. And so the statistics, there's all different surveys, different numbers, but it's really going up over that majority and getting into the sort of high majority, sort of 80% of people in firms seem to be using this now. The other thing that I'm seeing is these big announcements. Australia, New Zealand, UK, those are the places that I'm seeing most of these announcements coming from. And it's about we're using Copilot and we're partnering with Microsoft and we're doing stuff. We're getting on board with this. We've got our policies. We're putting our processes in place. We're experimenting. And then you've got other people using those products of the big legal publishers, LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters, even this new player, Harvey, and saying, look, we're investing in this. This is part of our business going forward, and we can see real gains in terms of time efficiencies and things that we can deliver for our client in a better way. So, that's my outsider's view. And the thing that I see it being used for in these surveys are things like legal research. Obviously, those legal research providers are sticking AI into their products and seeing what comes out of that. Document review and analysis, summarization of documents, stuff around contracts, drafting, memos, correspondence with clients. And then that's what's happening now. Sort of 70-80% of firms seem to be using it for those kinds of tasks. Maybe they're the low-hanging fruit. And then there's more sophisticated uses that I think probably aren't quite there yet in many cases, but things like document drafting and automation, case diagnosis, prediction in terms of what's happening in litigation and dispute resolution, things like due diligence for mergers and acquisitions or big real estate transactions, compliance and risk. So those are the things that aren't quite up there in the sort of mostly what this is being used for, but they're coming on stream and probably being developed at the moment.
Also AI avatars.
Yeah.
I'm referring to the lawyer who used an avatar to present their case. And so Alex going to provide us with some further information about how things are happening in law firms and what's the perspective and what's the direction, because we also hear from some law firms that they're not adopting the technology, or they've decided to delay things, and at the same time we hear a lot about that they're trying to use it somehow to increase efficiency.
Yeah, very happy to. And so largely what Mark has said around sort of the increase in adoption is definitely something that I've been seeing over the past year. And it is really interesting to see, though, that even though there has been an increase in people using AI and trying to embed it in their workflow, there are still a lot of people that are quite early on in their journey. I think the enthusiasm is definitely rising and sort of more people are wanting to experiment and get involved. But there is still a bit of a gap between those that have really run full force at AI and had got out of the gate early in terms of their training and capability building and sort of developing out of their use cases, versus others that might sort of, still be at the starting blocks a little and sort of experimenting in their day-to-day tasks and things like that. But there's not necessarily that movement into considering the legal workflows yet. So I think it is interesting to watch some of the players in the market, sort of, as you mentioned, Mark, the Harveys, sort of CoCounsel, some of those really legal specific AI platforms and seeing their uptake. There has been a lot, from what I understand, of sort of pilots and testing of those technologies within larger law firms. And it is really interesting to start comparing the outputs and the capabilities of those tools with some of the more general AI tools that people might have been tapping into, like a Copilot or ChatGPT, Claude, etc. So I think that that's really interesting to watch how people are starting to see the difference between the two and thinking about what a legal specific workflow does look like. But yeah, I will say that I think a few people are still a little bit early on in their journey compared to what some of the media says about the uptake and adoption. And I think there is also a difference between the tools that people are given within their firms and their teams, and then actually using those tools. So, firms might be procuring this technology, but are people using them on a day-to-day basis? And what does that actually look like in terms of engagement and revisiting those tools? I think that there is a bit of a danger if they're not embedded correctly, or there's not sort of the proper change management around it, that people get excited at the start and they start to use it, but maybe it's not giving them the outputs that they had wanted or hoped. And so there begins to be a bit of disillusionment as well as people begin to experiment. So I think those programs that go around the tools and sort of bringing them into different organizations and teams are really important to ensure that there is continued uptake and adoption of those exciting new tech tools that are coming in.
So you referred to Harvey, also Mark did, and you mentioned like CoCounsel. That means we have technologies that are specifically, like generative AI technology that is specifically made for legal practice. And then we have general generative AI like Gemini and ChatGPT. So when it comes to adoption in practice, like for law firms, then we would expect the law firms to adopt these tools that are made for legal context, rather than trying to use generative AI models such as ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude that are generic, models. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So large law firms are leaning, and from what I've seen, towards having some of these legal specific tools. That being said, it doesn't take away the need for Copilot or something similar. If you're operating on a Microsoft 365 environment, that's still something that gets used. And again, you're sort of using that in the context of, drafting emails and, meeting transcripts and all of those things. So I think there is still a place for that sort of more general AI tool. However, yeah, from what I'm seeing, most of the law firms are looking at these legal specific models and seeing what they could do, because there are very specific workflows that they can be applied to that. And again, it kind of has the additional layer of trust because it's been built with lawyers in mind. So I think that that's sort of where I'm seeing a lot of firms lean. Like there's been a few firms that have announced partnerships with sort of these legal specific generative AI tools. And it's also interesting to see some existing legal tech. So some of the matter management systems, contract lifecycle management systems, etc., that people have within, this is mostly sort of within in-house legal teams. Some of those systems are then adding AI functionality and AI components. So it's been interesting as well to understand how that is being used within in-house legal teams, because, you know, in some cases the functionality is really great, and then in other cases you can kind of see that it's something that's just been tacked on at the end because everyone's talking about AI and wanting to use AI. So it would be really important as, you know, an in-house lawyer or somebody looking to engage with this tech to really interrogate what the capability is and how it sort of works in the background and how that will actually work in practice. I would really advise, you know, teams, or sort of recommend that teams look at, you know, really specific workflow, and also look to do a proof of concept or some piloting with these different tools to really understand the outputs that it is going to give you, based on some of your own kind of, you know, methodology, or, you know, a contract or something like that, to just really see what its capability is, because I think in a lot of cases some of that capability can be overstated.
So what I'm really interested in around these specialized legal tools is that, you know, you see a lot of talk about in these surveys, lawyers are using the AI, and then it's a real big deal, at least in New Zealand, when a big law firm signs up and says, yeah, we're using whichever of these big providers specialized tool. It doesn't seem like it's ubiquitous. It doesn't seem like everyone's doing it. I understand that they're very expensive. I've also heard sort of rumors and whispers that maybe they don't work as well as perhaps they should, or we might imagine them to do. I have seen a lot more happening in overseas, in Australia, England, US. What do you reckon the state of play is? Is like every law firm basically going to be subscribing to one or the other of these specialized tools, like now or in a year or so? What do you think?
I just want to add something to that question. Also, do you think that if they're not doing it, or if they are planning to do it, do they have the time, you know, to manage learning the new platforms and, you know, keeping up with the technology and updates?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I will be interested to see how it plays out, because I think at the moment we're still in the phase of some extensive piloting. I know that there's a few firms that have sort of piloting two tools at the same time to really understand the comparison. And also, you know, to your point, there is a massive investment required. Like, you know, these tools are not cheap. And so I think it's really important for firms to validate that there is going to be ROI on whatever tool is chosen. So I feel like, you know, while a lot of firms are really interested in testing these larger scale or sort of enterprise level tools, you know, whether or not the investment is made in one of those tools, I think remains to be seen. Like you were saying, Mark, there have been a few announcements of that already, but it will be interesting to see if sort of all firms follow suit. You know, there's always the discussion around sort of buy versus build as well, which is, you know, maybe some firms have the ability to build their own, you know, AI tools in-house. And so I think that kind of plays into it as well. I think firms are very much in the scanning mode at the moment, and it kind of, you know, it's looking at those bigger players, but it's also looking at some of the newer sort of startup players and trialing them with specific groups and sort of workflows to really get a good picture of what is going to be worth the investment, because I think it is a, you know, it's a big decision. And to your point, Armin, as well, it's kind of, you know, if you're going to make the call to have that tech and to have everyone expected to use it, how are you enabling that to happen? Like, it will be so important to have, you know, actual supportive structures around it to give people the time, ensure that they really understand the tool, make sure all the checks and balances are in place, in terms of, you know, any governance frameworks and safety structures around that tool. Make sure that clients are comfortable with the use of that tool as well for their specific work. And there'll be a lot of things that kind of need to be in place before a firm, I think, is willing to make that big investment in sort of a bigger player. And I think it's interesting to contrast that with in-house legal teams who are often dealing with much smaller budget. It's kind of looking at, well, what makes sense from their perspective? How do we, again, ensure that they have the time, because they're also incredibly time poor, We're often dealing with a smaller team. We may not necessarily want something that's kind of at, the enterprise level, because again, enterprise level also brings with it more cost. And so it's sort of, I think they're probably looking at maybe some of the smaller, players out there, or the sort of players that have integrated AI into their existing tech solution. But, as I mentioned before, it'll be sort of really important to interrogate what level of AI capability that is and what that means. Because I think as well, there's a difference between saying, oh, this tool has AI, when it's sort of, automation or the type of AI we've seen for years, versus generative AI, or the ability to sort of redline contracts and all of those pieces as well. But yeah, I'm interested to see how it all plays out. And I think as well, it is a bit of an overwhelming tech landscape. I think it always has been in legal tech. There's always been many, many players. But I think now more so than ever, understanding which technology provider to put investment into will be a big call, given all of the infrastructure that has to go around it, in addition to sort of a financial.
I'm really fascinated with this idea of, build or buy, because one thing that I picked up, there's a really new paper from Professors Webb and Patterson from the University of Melbourne, just come out recently, and it's looking at what can generative AI do at the moment. It's a really good read. It should just be able to find that on Google, or maybe we put that in the show notes. But one of the things they identify is that actually some of the things that generative AI is seen as sort of revolutionary for, perhaps, and maybe not there yet, but in the future, things like legal research, figuring out what your arguments are, drafting your briefs, just getting your theory of the case and getting your arguments out. That kind of thing might not take up the bulk of what a lawyer does every day. It might be a sort of tiny minority for different lawyers, and amongst all of the other kinds of work they're doing with clients and negotiating and persuading and just getting on with business of a firm. So it's sort of interesting, if these tools are really expensive, maybe you do go for the build. And I've had a lot of joy just building with Gemini and NotebookLM and ChatGPT, knowing, I know the cases that I want to talk about. I can just do a normal search on Lexis or whatever free database and find the key cases. But then I can just build a little custom GPT or a little notebook and chat with the chatbot to my heart's content to figure out what's the best argument here. What am I missing with arguments that I'm putting forward? Here's my draft brief. Can you red team it? Can you come up with the counter arguments? And I'm wondering whether these big players, they're trying to get it right, and I'm sure they will, but are they going to be able to sell it for this inflated cost when smart lawyers who are willing to play with the tools might be generating a lot of that value already? It's just a thought.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about. I think the reason that it becomes appealing to kind of buy would be, what we talked about before, which is sort of the time. And I think while there are some people that are really enthusiastic about interrogating this and building their own points, and obviously Mark, it's an interest of yours, and sort of all of us on this call are really interested, but I would say for the most part, you're kind of dealing with maybe a level of apathy in some cases, but you're also just dealing with, I don't really have time to engage with that mentally. Like, I think there's an openness or a willingness to be able to use AI tools, but I think when it comes to spending the time to interrogate and to learn to the level that you would need to in order to build some of your own supporting, whether it be agents or sort of training your own model, I think that's where the sort of challenge lies. And so in such large organizations, if you're trying to embed sort of that structural change around using AI every day, then I think that's where the appeal comes in for these sort of ready-made, really good in terms of the level of interrogation and thinking that has been done around these different legal specific models. I do think that there's an appeal there. But in terms of the build, you're right, for the smaller teams as well, even looking at something, within the Microsoft 365 environment, that's something all teams, well, not all teams, but a lot of teams have access to. And so within that comes Copilot, and sort of depending on your license, the ability to use Power Automate. So could you build in some workflows or use some agents within Copilot as well, within your team. But again, it relies on somebody having the knowledge and the capability to do that. And that often is not lying within the legal team. And then even if there are people within the broader organization that may have an understanding about how to train those chatbots or sort of build those agents, they don't have the legal specific context. So it still would require a lot of downloading and collaboration with the legal team in order to get that right. But I do think it's still a really good option for teams that may not have access to the budget for maybe some of the more enterprise level and therefore a bit more expensive.
So we are talking about 4 categories of generative AI kind of chatbots. One is the generic ones that like ChatGPT and everybody can access them these days. The second type that you can build some kind of an app, not a chatbot, an app yourself. And that's what we call vibe coding, which means you just prompt it. You say, I want to create an app that look like this, and I can upload documents and it summarize it in this way and that way for me. So anyone can do that. And I don't think lawyers have that kind of knowledge yet, at least as of August 2025, to do it on their own. So the third type is the more complicated apps for lawyers. That is, there is an application like LexisNexis, there's a software or platform that we implement generative AI as part of it. So for instance, when it comes to search, there would be an option to use generative AI to search among other things that were already there. And finally, there's a category 4 that is building a new language model that is specified or specialized for legal context, like Harvey. That's what they did, working with OpenAI, and they spent, I think, $2 million around 2 years ago to create some kind of, I don't want to say a completely new language model, but they use a large amount of legal data to train the model, from kind of scratch. So these are 4 different categories. And my understanding is from the research we have been doing with 2 of my colleagues, Michael Legg and Vicky McNamara, the only thing that has been used by lawyers so far is the generic one. I heard maybe 2 cases so far that lawyers have used some kind of a specialized chatbot or AI implemented, platforms. Otherwise, majority are using the generic ones. And that's what worries me, because it may mean that law firms, they haven't adopted any type of, specialized legal generative AI, and lawyers are working on their own, and they're just using these generic chatbots because they're so accessible. And that's how a lot of them get in trouble, because it's not part of it's not part of a system. It's not the firm's, policy. There was no training or anything. And that may suggest that law firms are not doing enough, even at a very basic level, to inform or train their lawyers to, how to use this technology and how to benefit from it, and not, submit hallucinated cases and material to the court.
Yeah, I think that it's really highlighting the importance of having an AI strategy and an appropriate governance framework that underpins that, to make sure that the guardrails are in place for safe experimentation and use within an organization. And I think, I don't know, maybe I'm living within a little bit of a bubble, but I feel like most of the firms that I'm aware of have done that, and they've really run quite hard at having the guardrails in place, having appropriate training and capability programs because they're trying to minimize that shadow, AI, that using of the systems without people having the appropriate understanding of the risks, and also, the actual training to have AI literacy, to be able to really evaluate those outputs, and understand what they need to be doing in order to ensure that they're not, uploading confidential client data, etc., and things like that. So I think the firms that I'm aware of have all done a really great job really early on of putting those guardrails in place. Obviously, it sounds like there's not all firms are in that position, but I think, because, as you say, the general AI tools are so accessible, it was really important upfront to be really clear on what they should and should not be used for. And I think, there are some organizations, and I'm talking more broadly than law firms now, but I think there are some organizations that have said, no, you cannot use it, do not use it. But that is a problem within itself, because people are still going to use it. There's always going to be people that want to use those tools. They're there, they're accessible. So I think it is so important to err towards the side of having the guardrails and some sort of safe, space that people can operate within to test and use these tools, because they're going to do it regardless. So let's equip them with the right information and the right frameworks to make sure, the risks are minimized wherever we can. It is just sort of really interesting to think about, what that looks like. But I think with the legal specific tools, I think that's what is kind of front of mind now. And as more and more have come out and there is an understanding of what's in the market, more firms are trialing those to use. Again, they may be with specific pilot groups and not adopted more broadly across the organization yet. But I think that those are really front of mind in terms of trying to understand which one is going to be worth the investment to then support the firm, because, as we talked about before, there are limitations in terms of the extent of support that those general AI tools can provide for legal specific workflow.
So, Mark, I'm going to talk about something and ask you a question. So I said the way we see it in practice, a lot of law firms are not doing much about proper use or putting guardrails about use of generative AI. So that's why the number of misuses of generative AI in courts, the number of cases you're finding, are increasing instead of decreasing. And the one problem, it seems from what Alex has been saying, that when it comes to adopting more specialized generative AI, all those law firms that have to pay more and they have to try it and see whether you have the capability. Now it comes my question is about the capability. From many of these generative AI models that you have tried and you play around, do you see them as kind of capable technology that can actually make your life easier and make things more efficient? And asking it, like, with respect to specific legal research as a lawyer, when a lawyer may use this kind of technology, because to me, a lot of the advertisement out there is a hype about this technology and what it can deliver. And in many cases, it doesn't make things more efficient. If you do the traditional approaches, use the traditional approaches that go manually, do your search, you will be way faster. The reason it's more efficient in some cases is that people are not verifying the outputs. And I'm not saying in general it's not more efficient. There are many use cases, but at the same time, there are very common use cases that it doesn't seem to be as efficient. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, I'm an academic lawyer. I haven't been doing so much research recently, original research. I've been teaching and I've been discussing contract interpretation, implied terms, this kind of thing, complicated concepts, talking to students about it, setting exams. And what I can see is that if I train the AI on the cases, on my PowerPoints, and on my transcripts of my lectures, it can get an A in the exam. It knows what I'm going to say. A student could argue against what I'm going to say, but it can perfectly predict my answer, my A+ answer to a question. The other thing I can do with it is chat with it and just interrogate ideas and remind myself of, well, what did they say about this in this case? It's kind of like an advanced search that is conceptual and can help you with those concepts. And of course, sometimes it gets it wrong, but 90% of the time I look at it and say, yeah, that's right. I wouldn't say anything different. Now, I think when I get around to doing some more research, I can really see with the sort of Perplexity style or using one of the other products, that kind of AI-powered search, the deep research, I'm seeing the savings of time. You've got to wade through that. You've still got to be able to read 5,000 words, 10,000 words, but it is like a web search on steroids. The other thing I can see happening is when you get a whole lot of key articles, academic articles, key cases together, put that into a notebook LM or one of the other tools, get them together and just chat with them. And, an expert like myself or any of us, academics, lawyers who've done the work, they are going to see a huge amount of efficiency of being able to just get ideas out there. The AI is like just a idea generation machine, and then experts like ourselves, we can tick them off. Yeah, that sounds right. No, I'd tweak that. I'm going to merge that with an idea in a particular way. But it's just that another set of hands or another brain that you can riff off. A bit like a colleague, one of my colleagues said, I told her to use AI. She was sort of reluctant. And then she went and did it. And she said, look, I've just had the most intellectually satisfying and exhilarating week of my career because I got through a month of work in a week because I could just dialogue with this thing and use it as a research assistant. So that's from an academic perspective. And I definitely think in practice, you're going to get similar results for that kind of work. Like that's definitely not most of what legal practice is. That's a small aspect of legal practice, I think, that kind of academic style or the research and the argument, from what I understand. You're probably going to get all sorts of efficiencies elsewhere with the AI that I just can't even dream of because I don't even know what those tasks are. But yeah, certainly once people play around with it and become a little bit of a super user, if you just try it and see what it can do, you will blow your mind. That would be, it's not perfect. It's not everything. You still have to know your stuff, but definitely people got to figure it out how they can leverage it and just play with it.
So I have 2 points. One is the fact that it can make things more efficient and it blow your mind. I've been in many workshops and teaching people, how to use generative AI. And the simplest thing that I asked them to, have a hands-on, practice with generative AI, when I asked them to try it, I could see their faces, they smile. Like it is just so surprising to me that you have never tried this simple thing. And it seems many people didn't, and they're happy with the outcome. So I agree that it can make things more efficient, but at the same time, like when it comes to courts and cases, again, out of these more than 350 cases of misuse of generative AI, I cannot remember a single case a lawyer says that, well, I used it to tell me what are the problems, in my argument. Some of them they say I use it to improve my writing or things like that, but not as as an assistant the way that you were just referring to. So there are many uses of generative AI that can make you more efficient. But what it seems, at least majority of lawyers in practice are using it, as many of them mentioned in cases that they use it as some form of Google. So they just prompt it or put their question in, and they expect to get the correct answer while it requires verification. And that's the type of use of generative AI that, in my opinion, is not efficient, that it generates a whole bunch of things and you have to verify every bit of it for millions of hours. It really, if you want to properly do it, it takes a long time and doesn't worth the time.
That's a very good point. And I think that's why sort of having the setup done right is so important. To your point, I mean, it takes so long to verify something. And if you are just using sort of an unstructured prompt or asking it generally and it's not pointed at a curated set of, legislation or case law or relevant documents that it needs to look at, then, you are having to go through and manually check everything anyway. So at that point, it's much faster to do it yourself, I think. So I think that's why it's important that, when you are thinking about use cases or certain technology to use, it's very specific things. Like, for example, you have a document or a set of documents that you want to interrogate. Here is a set of documents. Here are the questions that I'm asking about it. Maybe it's in the course of sort of an investigation or something that's requiring you to put together things like chronologies. And again, it's sort of knowing what the AI is good at and then having those structures in place to then make it easy to verify or audit the output as well. Because as I say, if it's generating a whole bunch of stuff, that's not going to be faster. Let's be really targeted and be really specific with what we're trying to get from this output. Here is the specific use case. I understand the information that I'm pointing it at. I understand my sources. So again, that sort of reduces the risk a little bit more. But then it's also still checking that what it pulled out is within the right context, or it's been applied in the right way, or it's interpreted sort of a particular sentence or something that's within that document source correctly. There's still that level of verification, but I agree you kind of have to do as much as you can to sort of point it in the right direction, be very targeted with what you're asking and what you're doing in order to actually see some of those efficiency gains. for other things that are not legal work, for example, doing a little bit of general research about something or wanting to write an article or something for a website. Lawyers often have articles on sort of new legislation and case law and things that are coming out. So stuff like that, it's quite helpful in the more general sense. But yeah, if you were using it for a specific legal purpose, you need to be incredibly targeted, and there needs to be some strategic thinking about the setup beforehand. Otherwise, the efficiencies just aren't there.
So this is the end of this episode, and we talked about how in practice generative AI being adopted specifically by law firms, and we talked about some obstacles. We talked about that we have generic chatbots that are not good for legal practice, and we talked about the specialized legal generative AI tools, but they are problems with their capabilities, whether they are good enough for the purposes of legal practice, and the cost of it, and how much time does it take to train lawyers and the staff to use these tools, and the cost of specialized legal AI chatbots because they're way more expensive. So these are all together. There are some of the reasons that why generative AI is not being adopted as much as we were expecting or it's been talked about.
How do you stay up to date with AI news?
I don't.